Hello and welcome to Policy Voices. I'm your host, Sabina Șancu, and on this week's episode, we are going to discuss a very different theme to what we usually talk about. We're going to talk about AI and data centers from the perspective of energy consumption. This is in connection to our Climate and Energy Summit, which is going to take place on the 23rd of September. If you're interested in joining and you haven't signed up yet, you still have the time to do that. This year's summit will ask how decarbonization can remain a cornerstone of European growth, rather than a casualty of rising geopolitical tensions and competing policy priorities. So the focus will be on how to turn Europe's clean tech leadership into its competitive edge, reduce strategic dependencies, and ensure a level playing field for industry. So in my conversation for the podcast this week, I talked to Thomas Spencer, who's a senior energy analyst at the International Energy Agency. He's also one of the lead authors of the IEA's report, Energy and AI, which came out in spring this year. My colleague, Davide Sofia, who's a program executive here at Friends of Europe, was just the other day in Piacenza at the Festival of Contemporary Thinking, where he met up with Dennis Jaromil Royo and interviewed him to give us a different perspective on AI and energy.
My name is Davide Sofia. I'm here with Dennis. He's the director of the Dyn.org Foundation. He's an applied cryptographer, and he's working extensively on philosophy of technology, ethics, free software, and the combination with the societal issues. So we are so honored to have him here today, talking about artificial intelligence, its role in society, its connection with the energy system.
You'll hear that in the second part of the interview. But until then, let's cover some of the basics together with Thomas Spencer. You are one of the lead authors of the IEA's report on energy and AI. So you're someone with a lot of very specialized knowledge, and I'm really grateful to have you here. But I think I'd like us to start from basics for people who are interested but may not necessarily know too much about data centers and AI. So could you tell us a little bit about how regular data centers work and their environmental energy impact, and how the AI data centers are different to that?
Sure. Firstly, thanks so much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. So yeah, we hear a lot about data centers these days, but not everyone is fully aware of what they are and what they do. And yet they're really so central to our lives. So you can essentially think of data centers as big rooms full of computers. Unlike the computers that you and I use every day, these ones don't have screens, but they do similar things. Essentially, they store and process data. And so today, for example, when you turn on your TV and watch something on Netflix or on YouTube, that material will be stored in a data center, and your TV will send a signal out to the data center, and it will send the information back to your TV. And of course, we live our lives increasingly online. So the same thing happens when we make a financial transaction, when we look up something on the internet. So regarding data centers' energy and environmental impact, I think the basic point is that data centers convert electricity into information. And so they do consume electricity as part of their operations. And with the rise of AI, we're seeing increasing investments in larger and larger data centers, and therefore concerns about the increase in electricity consumption that comes from data centers. And data centers are in three ways kind of unusual energy infrastructure. The first is that they are spatially concentrated, so they tend to cluster around cities, and this is because that's where most of the demand for digital services lie. Secondly, they are getting larger and larger. So a few years ago, a large data center might have been 50 megawatt. Today, we're seeing projects that are regularly 100 megawatt in size, and projects in the pipeline that are 2 gigawatt. So to put that in perspective, 2 gigawatt is roughly the annual electricity consumption of a city of several million people. So that's really significant. And then the third characteristic that makes data centers an unusual kind of energy infrastructure is that they can be developed quite quickly compared to, for example, power plants or factories or transmission lines, which often take a long time through the planning process and then construction. In contrast, data centers can be built in as little as 18 months. And so these three factors mean that we're seeing increasing numbers of larger and larger data centers looking to connect quickly to electricity systems that are often already stretched because they're close to existing demand sources. And that is a big challenge. But it also means that data centers are often, rather than a national or a global challenge, more of a local challenge. And so if we look at data center electricity consumption today, it's about 415 terawatt hours at the global level. That's roughly equivalent to the size of a country like France, which sounds a lot, and of course it is, but it's only 1.5% of total global electricity consumption today. So you have this kind of dichotomy between, at the global level, data centers still occupy a relatively small place in our energy system, but at the local level, they can create substantial challenges. Now, just to answer the last part of your question, how is AI changing this? Essentially, AI data centers are much more power intensive than conventional data centers. You can see this in the power demand of the servers that go into data centers. Servers are essentially the computers that do the information processing. And a conventional server may have a power capacity of about 1.5 kilowatt. That's roughly equivalent to an air conditioning unit. But a AI specialized server might have a power capacity of 10 kilowatt or more. And so you're seeing these increasingly power intensive data centers coming up very quickly. And that's because of the second thing that AI is doing, which is turbocharging demand. And so we've seen a sudden surge in investment in data centers, in planning applications for new data centers based on AI demand, which is here today or expected to be coming in the future.
It's interesting. I think especially because so many of these data centers have been built so far in the States and in China, but there's a lot of effort to bring these in the EU. So trying to think about these like smaller countries and the impact that it has on these smaller national electricity grids is definitely something that is the conversation we should be having here at Friends of Europe. And I was wondering, bringing all of this AI power into Europe, it's something that Brussels has said is desirable to be competitive in the AI field. And I'm wondering, given all of our efforts to become a little bit greener, which have already been abandoned a bit after COVID, is this something that we should be trying to do, or is this derailing us from our efforts to become more carbon neutral?
Let's start firstly with a few numbers that can help put the context around this question. So if we look at installed capacity of data centers today, the United States accounts for about 45% of the global share, China for another 25%, and the European Union for about 15%. And so even if you see, relative to GDP, the European Union lags a bit behind the share of China, the share of the United States. I think there are two goals behind the European Union's push to localize data centers. The first is around strategic autonomy and digital sovereignty. And the truth is that data centers do play a really critical part in the modern economy, whether we think about the security of our critical systems, our financial networks, our commercial networks. So there is a goal of improving digital sovereignty in Europe. And the second is the innovation and growth spillovers that can potentially come from having a domestic IT industry. And so, for example, if you look at the Draghi report, he highlighted that one of the main things that has kept Europe falling behind the United States in relative terms is the lack of a domestic IT industry. And so if we are able to localize data centers, maybe that will also have positive spillovers for our domestic IT industry in Europe. Whether this can be compatible with Europe's energy and climate goals is really a question of how it is done. But it's fair to say that, as of today, relative to total electricity consumption in Europe, data centers are still a pretty small share. Certainly less than in the United States. Maybe in the order of 1.5 to 2% of Europe's electricity consumption is from data centers today.
And it would depend truly from place to place what source of electricity these countries or regions are using. If you think about more like coal intensive regions in like Poland or Bulgaria, it would be a wholly different situation compared to the Netherlands. And I know that there's a lot of efforts to make them more reliable on renewables now as they're being built, rather than trying to retroactively bring it into a space where they can use renewables. But I know those are also tend to be like energy sources that fluctuate, and AI data centers like a more constant flow of energy. But could you explain that a little bit?
Yes. So one of the primary operating characteristics that data centers need to have is extremely high levels of reliability. So they need to operate, with what's called Six Sigma reliability, which essentially means you want 99.9999% uptime, and you don't want any downtime. Now, you might think that this means that data centers are not so keen on renewables, but this is not actually the case. What they are keen on is a grid connection. Generally speaking, they prefer to be connected to the grid than to have their own generation projects on site. And this is because the most reliable source of electricity is from the grid. They also have backup power sources, so batteries that can help them ride through a fault in the grid, and backup generators which kick in the really very rare cases where the grid has an outage. But generally speaking, they want to be connected to the grid. And this means that if renewables are supplying the grid and the grid is doing the job of balancing renewables with other sources of generation, with demand flexibility, with storage technologies like batteries, then there's absolutely no problem for renewables to supply data centers. Quite in the contrary, data center operators are very happy to sign power purchase agreements with renewable companies, but that power is being fed into the grid, not directly into the data center. And indeed, our analysis shows that these power purchase agreements, largely in renewables in Europe, can be more cost effective than buying purely from the grid at prevailing spot prices, because in the last few years electricity prices have been very high in Europe. And so from that perspective, renewables power purchase agreements provide data center operators with a nice price hedge compared to buying electricity only on the spot market.
Within the EU, what countries would have the kind of grid that it would take to uphold like a large number of AI data centers? And which ones are still like what are the problems with the ones that don't have this capacity, whether it's the ones that also incorporate renewables or not?
Today, the primary characteristic that data center operators are looking for is principally speed of connection. They are actually not that sensitive to cost, although cost is a factor that enters into their decision making. But they're not that sensitive to cost because cost is a relatively small share of the total cost of a data center project. Most of the cost is in the extremely expensive computing equipment that goes into data centers. Particularly with the rise of AI, the computing equipment that goes into data centers is extremely expensive. And so the cost of electricity is not so significant. But what does matter is the time to market. So speed of connection. That means, of course, permitting procedures that are quick and smooth. But in many places in Europe, you have quite congested electricity networks. So particularly in traditional data center markets like Dublin, like in some places in the Netherlands, like in Frankfurt, there are challenges with building new data centers because the grid is already congested. So grid congestion is one of the major challenges in Europe. And then, of course, the third characteristic is most data center operators do have climate goals. And so they do like to procure renewable energy, but that renewable energy doesn't necessarily need to be located in exactly the same place as the data center project. And of course, proximity to markets still matters for data centers. So they still like to be located in places close to where they think the demand is going to come from. And that still means largely close to major urban areas, even with the rise of AI. And so you come back to the problem of congestion of our electricity networks, which is probably the major challenge in Europe regarding data center projects.
Also, looking at the sustainability side, also wanted to ask the question about water, because AI data centers and AI ones in particular use a lot of water for cooling purposes. And a lot of these centers are in areas where there's a lot of water strain. It's been already documented in the US, it's documented in places like Spain. So how do we fairly account for that in the EU, where we already have a lot of countries that are at risk of desertification and fresh water is scarce?
So maybe I'll just set out why data centers use water in the first place. So I mentioned that data centers essentially convert electricity information into information. And in doing so, the byproduct is heat. And so we know this when we use our laptop intensively, it generates a lot of heat, and we have these big fans which dissipate that heat to enable the chips in our laptop to operate at an optimal temperature. It's the same thing in data centers, but they are so power intensive and they generate so much heat that they need dedicated cooling systems. Fans are not enough. And for that, they often use evaporative cooling technology, which consumes water. So the amount of water used by data centers, it varies quite a lot by location and technology. By location, because it depends on the ambient temperature. So for example, in a place that is hot and humid, you might see 3 times the water consumption than in a place that is cool and with a temperate climate. And it varies by the technology that is used for cooling. So we estimated in the report that a 100 megawatt data center, which is a large data center today, but not compared to the projects that are being developed, uses in the United States, so these are numbers considering the climate of the United States on average, uses the amount of water equivalent to about 6,500 households. So it's a not insignificant amount, but still not so much. The important part of that is that 60% of that water consumption is indirect. And this is essentially the water consumption that is used in the generation of the electricity that is then fed into the data center, or for example, in the mining of the coal or production of natural gas that goes into the generation of electricity. So let's not forget that our electricity system as it stands today already consumes a lot of water, that the shift to renewables would dramatically lower the water consumption of the electricity system, and that 60% of a data center's water consumption is indirect, so upstream of the operations of the data center. We estimate that by 2030, data centers might consume about 1.2 trillion liters of water every year. Again, this sounds like a huge amount, but it's equivalent to about 0.2% of total water consumption by all economic activities at the global level, so industry, households, agriculture. But of course, we need to do whatever we can to mitigate that. So we essentially have 2 important levers. One is siting data centers in places that are not water stressed and have cooler climates. And the other is, technology innovations. So it could be innovating with more efficient chips that produce less waste heat as a byproduct of their operations, or it could be innovating and applying new cooling technologies which are starting to be deployed, but which essentially don't consume water. So we can use, for example, a direct liquid cooling, which circulates a coolant around the surface without evaporating it, and so it doesn't consume it, or immersion cooling, which essentially involves it fully immersing the servers in a liquid coolant, and again, not using evaporation as the heat exchange process. So there are innovations that are happening on the cooling side that mean that there are options to reduce the impact of data centers on water consumption.
I was reading it and I was like, are we sure, guys? Are we sure we want to do this? And to wrap up, I wanted to ask, with the fact that, the AI industry is growing, it's making it impossible for people, even for people who do not want to use AI, to opt out of it. It's getting integrated into many of our current technologies. And then in a lot of places, people end up having to foot the bill with rising energy prices in some areas that are very data center intensive. So I'm wondering if we should moderate this exponential growth of AI for the sake of resource management and for economic equity. And if so, how? Or if not, why not?
It's a great question to close on. So maybe a few different angles that we can approach the question from. The first one is, what is the outlook for electricity consumption from data centers? I mentioned in one of our previous questions that electricity consumption from data centers is set to double by 2030. But we need to understand that there's a lot of uncertainty around this. It's a new sector that is growing very rapidly. And so it's possible that it could be much less. It's possible that it could be a bit more. What we are seeing is extremely rapid efficiency improvements in both the software and the hardware that is used for AI. So, for example, we see innovation in the design of AI models that allows them to provide answers to queries much faster, but with much lower energy consumption. Google, for example, recently released a paper in which they analyzed that they had reduced the energy consumption of an average query to their AI models by 33 times over the last 12 months. So that's not 33%, it's a reduction by 33 times. And at the same time, we see extremely rapid improvements in the energy efficiency of the chips that are being used to run these AI models. So it is possible that we could move into a future in which AI demand continues to grow and we use AI in our everyday lives, but without strongly rising electricity consumption from data centers, if these efficiency trends continue and are strengthened over time. But at the same time, we see trends that point in the other direction, right? I think people are not really aware that it's not just AI use per se that matters for electricity consumption and energy consumption. It's how we use AI. So let me give you two examples. Generating an image or a video is far more intensive in energy terms than generating text. Maybe an order of magnitude more energy intensive. So in our analysis at the IEA, we estimated that generating text consumes about 1 watt hour per prompt. That's not very much, but generating a video could consume as much as 120 watt hours per prompt. So that's a huge difference. And so if we see AI starting to move into much more image and video generation on, for example, social media, then that could push trends in the other direction. One other example is that we see evolutions in the design of AI models that push towards more energy consumption rather than less. So, for example, a big trend over the last 12 months in AI model design has been the emergence of what is called not large language models, so that's like classic ChatGPT, but what are called large reasoning models. And these are essentially models that think more, and I'm putting that in inverted commas for our listeners, that think more when you ask them a question. And these models can perform better than classic large language models like ChatGPT on certain kinds of problems, like, for example, coding or problem solving, where thinking through the problem in a structured way can be beneficial. But they are much more energy intensive than classic large language models, maybe 10 times more energy intensive. And so, for example, if you type a query into ChatGPT and it takes a long time to come back with a message like ChatGPT thought for 7 minutes, that's a pretty good marker that in thinking for 7 minutes, it has consumed a lot of electricity. So there are also trends that push us in another direction. How these trends play out in the future is really not clear because things are moving so quickly and because it is a new industry. What is clear is that, and this comes back to your question, we need consumers to be informed about the impacts that they're having. We need them to have the information necessary to understand the impacts that they're having. So in the same way that, we have labels for the emissions intensity of the cars that we purchase or the household appliances that we purchase, we need consumers to be able to understand also what is the impact of the digital life that they are leading.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Now, on to the bigger perspective with Davide and Dennis, aka Jaromil.
So I would like to start this short interview by making a point related to the fact that right now technology and artificial intelligence are not just leading us through the discovery of reality, but are also shaping and sometimes even substituting our perception of what reality is itself. So recently the focus for the general public has been on large language models, so as we know, but where do you see actually the potential for additional applications of artificial intelligence? And maybe if you can help us think in a way that what is AI going to do that maybe we do not expect right now?
Thanks, Davide. And hi, everyone. I'm better known by my nickname, by the way, Jaromil, rather than Dennis. And it's something that I thought of. I mean, as working as an applied cryptographer, I come from a very different field. So I work on authentication, cryptography, like data information security. But there is one thing I'd like to start this answer from is that the difference between cryptography, something like we do in cryptography, and artificial intelligence, or better said, large language models, is determinism. So when we deal with authentication, we deal with determinism. If you have signed a document, I can verify and I can be sure that you signed that document. This is something that a large language model can never do. They are systems that are non-deterministic. So the answers that they give us, they may change even if the question stays the same. So we cannot really rely on these answers because they may be different and they are generated from a statistical analysis of syntax of language. So we talk about new systems that are non-deterministic. And I think this is the biggest limit of large language models and deep machine learning, that it's important to keep in mind that we are dealing with machines that, given the same input, they will not give us the same output. So what happens inside is not transparent to us, is not known to us. It's important because we should not take the output, the answers, as universally true, let alone the fact we should not take anything as universally true, at least from my philosophical point of view. But the answers that we get, they are approximations of statistical knowledge in language models. What is interesting, I think, in the panorama of future LLM and machine learning technologies is the fact that they can achieve the ability to give deterministic answers. And they can do that with a different paradigm of development, which is nowadays referred as agentic AI. But I think the technical terms are MCP servers, for instance. Like this is like the standard developed by Anthropic, the cloud makers. There is an API, so it's an application protocol interface that is designed to be queried by large language models. What does that mean? Is that, say you have a database of data. To retrieve this data from the database, you have to formulate a query in technical language like SQL for databases, simple query languages. You have to write a piece of code that says, I want all entries that have this name and are born in this date. And so you query a database of people born, anagrafe, so people born in a place. And you have to draw this query in computer language. Large language models are able to formulate this query from our request. So I can ask a large language model to make a query to a database. Say I want to have the list of all people born on that day in Piacenza whose name starts with A. This will not work for the database. It will not work with any existing system. But it will work with LLM being inside, mediating this sort of role. It will make the query and it will give us deterministic data because it will not invent it. It's something that cannot answer right now. What does that mean? It means that in public as well private sector, the function of dashboards, of data visualization, could change radically, being mediated by LLM. On the other side, we don't solve the trust problem. We are still trusting an LLM to make that, to execute that correctly. But we can verify it. We can also say, show me the query you're running, and we can also run it on our own. So we can verify that the result is really what we want. I believe this is the real interesting step into the progress of LLM. I think Anthropic is on the forefront of this because they are the first one developing the standard MCP server standard, so that we as developers have the opportunity to develop APIs that are made to be queried by LLMs. And that's also what I'm working on right now.
Thank you very much. I think this your answer was extremely interesting because it gives us a bit the sense of the future development, like where is exactly the progress and the in the future that we'll see related to large language models, non-determinism and determinism. So thank you very much for this. But if I think about your answer and I think about the future, I'm also thinking about maybe what are the bottlenecks and the barriers that we are facing right now. If we've had as part of this conversation, we've been able to speak with Thomas Spencer from the International Energy Agency, and they've recently done a lot of work on what a data center currently is to power AI, how many of them are being built for the development of such large language models. And so, as a professional in your field, I would like to ask you, what do you think about the current development that we are seeing? Where do you maybe see the bottlenecks, and maybe what could be the unintended consequences of such a development in the way in which we are seeing it right now?
Well, data centers historically required a lot of energy, and we have built quite some in Europe already, that can provide us an historical outlook on the effective consumption of energy within certain area and the availability of this energy. So we have some data from the last 10 years, 15 years that we can use to map where it's possible and where it's not. So the first thing is geographically analyzing the best way, the best places where to build these things. There will be always demand for data centers. LLM data centers are slightly different in technology. So there may be demand for LLM specific data centers. So data centers for the so-called AI. I think it's a completely incorrect term, artificial intelligence, by the way. So I refer to it as LLM. And to build new data centers, maybe it may have a meaning, it may have a reason. We may have a reason to build new data centers geared towards LLMs because they make a specific accelerated use of accelerated chips, so-called GPUs, that are graphic processing units. So we make use of things built for accelerated graphics in the past. That's why NVIDIA is on the forefront as a provider of hardware for this, the company, and other companies that have produced accelerated graphics cards. So what we envision is data centers that are different from the existing ones, that are not made to store large amounts of data, but are made to compute at a very fast rate. So they will produce more heat. They will be warmer. Again, this is something to take into account for a geographical analysis of where to place them. And in general, we have to be very careful because they will be consuming a lot of energy. And I'd rather say we should really keep an eye on the energy consumption. We should scale it down. And this is very long because we are on a hype curve right now. So it's full hype. And therefore, what is produced today is not the optimum. And therefore, I believe that in the next 10 years, we will see a lot of progress in energy consumption as well. I mean that within 5 to 10 years, we will have chips that are optimized to consume less energy in the LLM field because they will be specialized. Like now we call GPUs, graphic processor units, we use the old term. In the future, maybe we have so specialized chips that will be LLM processor units. So they will be specialized and so they will consume less energy. So weighting is also, it's also in the question. The time is also in the question. And in general, I think that cities should prioritize serving vital support for humans rather than for machines. And therefore, like geographically, we need to see where to put them. But basically, the usage of these data centers is very agile through cables, through data cables, through network cables. So we don't need to have them nearby cities. Ultimately, I think that we should be very careful before thinking to build another data center. Throwing hardware at a hype is never a good idea, I believe. And an applause to my city mayor in Amsterdam that decided, Femke Halsema decided to not place a data center or to limit the use of data centers around Amsterdam, because the cities require more energy and there are other things on the agenda of energy producers and consumptions. For instance, I work in the field of circular economy, and one of the visions we have is a mine that is nearby the city, so precious metals, rare metals mining nearby the city, so urban mining, which means recycling of materials, devices, electronic devices that is nearby the city. So a factory that is close by and where the high density of this pollution is produced. And this sort of urban mining will require a lot of energy because the processes, also there can be progress, but the process requires a lot of energy. And so my question is, what is the priority, to have a faster LLM service, or nearby a city, for instance, have facilities that can recycle our electronic waste faster? In my opinion, and I'm still attached to the green agenda, which is unfortunately right now being a little bit overlooked, in my opinion, we should stick to the green agenda and keep an eye on priorities and usage of energy that help us lower the pollution.
Thank you very much for having such a comprehensive answer on this. And I mean, I want to come back to a point that you just mentioned on the idea of being very careful of throwing hardware to a hype in this moment, especially because I have the feeling that sometimes maybe we are in such a complex process. We are going very fast on one side, and then we are forgetting many others. And just to give a bit of context in terms of some data that we recently had from important reports on the development of energy and artificial intelligence, maybe in the large language models in the broader sense, they're related to cybersecurity and cyber attacks. If you think about 5 years ago, in 2020, we had a number of cyber attacks that in the range of 4 years has grown by 4 times. This is actually the number of cyber attacks specifically on energy utilities has increased vastly. And so I think that this is a challenge that is so much more like it's going to become so much more integrated the more that these kind of systems are developed. So maybe my question to you would be whether you are hopeful that in the adaptation process to these kind of threats, how should society maybe start changing itself to include maybe cybersecurity in a more holistic way? The more we maybe we have a society that is, I wouldn't use the word dependent, but is so much more integrated with these kind of digital tools.
Good question. And how to do it and how to make it holistic, because it's very difficult to make holistic something that is made to defend, shield. It's militaristic in a way. So it's like it is a military grade sort of defense that we have to apply on civil infrastructure. So the dynamic is clearly that war is coming back at home. We were not used to this. We were used, like from a North American point of view, you send, also as part of NATO, Italy has always sent soldiers outside. We participate to wars, and we never see it at all. We're not used to. Our grandparents maybe have seen war at all. And we lived through a period in which war could be made in another place and was never really coming back. Now we see it coming back with the cyber dimension, so with the digital dimension, with the internet connected everything, also big things like a power production plant, a nuclear plant in places where there is. And this becomes a surface of attack because it's an explosive device within the enemy's line. So war is changing in this way, is evolving, and is coming home. We are not anymore sending people to make war outside. This war will be coming back to us through these channels, and defending from it is not a question. We need to defend our society from this, The defenses right now are military grade defenses, and obviously there are military personnel involved. What we need to envision is that this military personnel works with civil society, and so we cannot envision, for instance, an agency for the cybersecurity, for national cybersecurity, made only by militaries. We need to progressively involve also technicians, civil society representatives, public and private sector from the civil society, not only from the military, because we need to have a holistic and 360 degrees view on the threats and on the mitigations. And I call this demilitarizing cybersecurity. It's important not because idealistically, because I don't like the military or not. I have no problem with that, and I work myself with the German Military Academy. But you see, at Helmut Schmidt University, we have personnel like me that are not military or come from a military career. And I think that is important because the threats will be hybrid, and we need an analysis that is, again, 360 degrees. We cannot expect these attacks to lower down because the connectivity is only increasing. We can expect these attacks to be more. The first ones, I remember already, Bruce Perens, something like 20 years ago, was giving this scenario, like when he saw like the first energy plants in the US being connected to the internet, he said, this will happen. Bruce Perens, the founder of the open source initiative. So you see, we need to have these sort of things. Since we are in Piacenza in Italy, I like to mention that I believe the Agenzia of Cybersecurity Nazionale, ACN, is doing a great job with this, I believe, because they are not only military personnel, they are hiring many people in civil society, because they are hiring a lot of young people, and because they started 4 years ago, just 4 years ago, and they already grow a lot. They have a very hard mission. They enter a field that is full of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So it's hard to tell the story of what they're doing. Their mission is securing hospitals, securing public administration, securing networks that are critical to the integrity of society. And it's not an easy task. Imagine entering an hospital and telling people that they don't have to stick their password under their monitor. From here to how the data of the patients is stored. It's a huge amount of things that need to be done. But we cannot surrender now. I mean, we need to be working at securing our infrastructure. I wish this would not be possible, but I think that's how history is going. If we have more wars, we have to expect the war to come to us, unfortunately. I wish and I hope everyone involved in cybersecurity and everyone involved in the field of cyber warfare keeps in mind we are all working for peace. So that is the final objective.
I think that's as much as this can be sometimes a bit of a gloomy outlook, the idea that you present of collaboration between the different parties. I think it's always something that can bring a bit of positivity and hope into the discussion. And we ourselves, I think we try in all of our activities to make sure that we have some this type of approach. As Jaromil has mentioned, we are currently in Piacenza, as Jaromil is one of our European young leaders, and we are honored to be here with him in Piacenza as part of the Festival del Pensare Contemporaneo, which is a great festival bringing in more than 20,000 citizens to many different events. So this is part of our collaboration, and this trying to connect experts, policymakers, and many different kind of actors with citizens on the ground. So thank you again for the time that we had here today.
Thanks, Davide, for having me. It's a fantastic festival. Yeah. Beautiful city also, Piacenza.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers.
Thank you so much, Thomas, and thank you, Davide and Jaromil. I hope you enjoyed this week's podcast and that you'll also be interested in our Climate and Energy Summit happening next week on the 23rd of September. And as for me, you'll hear from me next week on Fridays as usual.